50 years ago in Glasgow from across Europe, paediatric nephrologists came together to share their work. For children affected, it was a time of terrible suffering, and families watched their children die without hope. Here are some early pioneers who are still able to share their stories. They represent many who cannot be here. There are many unsung heroes. Listen to their past and look to the future. There's still much for us to do, to discover and to heal.
The origin and founding of the European Society for Paediatric Nephrology, and I'm Professor Gavin Arneil. On behalf of myself, my wife June, who was hostess at the 67 Foundation meeting, and Miss Lily Plank, who did all the secretarial, ESPN secretarial work here for 8 years for us, including the Foundation meeting. Welcome back to Glasgow after 50 years.
I remember that in the Foundation dinner in Glasgow, Professor Arneil insisted that the ESPN was founded as a society for improving, not only to study and investigate pediatric patients, but improving them.
What were the conditions like at the start of my career? During my 3 years of training in pediatrics, 1964 to 67, infectious diseases were core business. Uropathies were handled by urologists for adults, and kidney disorders in children were considered exceptional. The head of my department felt that nephrotics were easily treated with steroids, that acute glomerulonephritis cured itself by bed rest, and HUS was a life-threatening disorder for which no treatment was available, besides transfusions. And indeed, in that 3 years period, 12 patients were diagnosed with Moscovich disease, the old term for HUS, and I assisted at the autopsy of 9 patients.
The thing I remember is the length of hospitalizations. Although we knew it was chronic diseases, for instance, a child with nephrotic syndrome could spend months. And also the conditions of hospitalizations. For instance, I remember visits of parents were limited in time, not at night, not in the morning.
We should not forget that at that time there was practically no renal replacement therapy. So if children were in hospital, they in end-stage renal failure, they would be sent home to die.
We could do peritoneal dialysis, with this technique of torero, which was a kind of nightmare, without any drugs to prevent fear, pain, and all that. But it ended by death. So during my residency, during 1 year, we knew that all those children who had been on chronic kidney disease during years would die. And they did. And of course, dying, especially at that period, from renal failure was really something terrible.
And nephrotic syndrome, of course, was an impossibility in terms of treatment. And I can even recall now finding resistant nephrotics requiring Southey's tubes inserted into the legs with the children sort of sitting on benches with their legs in buckets so that the edema could be drained away because we didn't have adequate and strong enough diuretics to manage such things.
During my assistant time, I had the opportunity to assist to the first hemodialysis in a boy with acute renal failure. And it was really an exciting period because the company was coming with a device and a lot of people were helping us to do this treatment in a good way, and I can tell you the boy recovered.
Did we think about doing long-term dialysis in children?
I have asked now 6 people, because my feeling was that it just again crept up on us. Because we were already dialyzing adults and looking after children, inevitably we ended up with some children with renal failure. And I asked Chisholm, I'm just going through several of the nurses who were crucial, of course, in this enterprise, who had to set up new technology to do long-term dialysis in quite smaller and smaller children as we threw smaller and smaller children at them. So we moved from over 10-year-olds, down to 20 kilos, and then very few people in the world were attempting to dialyze chronically any child under 20 kilos at that time. So it was a rather bold step, and we did think hard about that transition. But at the beginning, it just happened. They were there, and they needed treatment, and then we had realized suddenly that we had half a dozen children on long-term dialysis, and we'd better start organizing a proper unit.
Of course, there was no transplantation at that time, so those children had to wait. And as far as I remember, each dialysis lasted, I don't remember whether it was 8 or 12 hours. Honestly, those 4 children, they didn't die, but they really experienced very uncomfortable periods. But in a way, for parents, the nightmare of progressive death was over. And I very well remember the atmosphere. At least he is alive. Let's do it the best we can.
The next one was erythropoietin. Children used to run with haemoglobins of 3 and 5 grams on dialysis, and we used to debate whether to actually transfuse them at all. And it must have been a remarkable improvement for them when they could get the haemoglobins up to 7, 8, 9 and 10, quite a new thing for them.
It's very simple for managing this apparatus. And we started to treat this patient as the first child in the Orphan Necker Hospital.
When I first started, renal biopsies were undertaken using the modified Wim Silverman needles. We would mark out the site of the lower pole of the offending kidney with marks on the child's back based on either an IVU preceding the procedure or by calculated guesswork, if you might put it that way. And we aimed at what we hoped was the appropriate spot.
So what was amazing is that I was very young, only 32, and everything had to be created. It was the first renal biopsy, the first hemodialysis, the first peritoneal dialysis. So everything had to be created. And because I was very young, the whole staff was very young. And there was a kind of atmosphere of startup because everybody was young, sometimes very naive.
1970, yeah. And then we had the same year, we had the first renal transplant. And the surprising thing is that this patient who was a 7-year-old with hemolytic uremic syndrome, of course at that time we didn't know about typical and atypical, but he still has his first graft functioning. It was from a deceased donor, so it was really surprising. But of course we have not been successful in all over further patients. We have realized that also with all these patients that psychosocial care is extremely important, and we started the group. My wife Christina, she was also very active as a former teacher.
In the beginnings, I remember having traveled in helicopter to fetch kidneys in a regional hospital.
Benim düşündüğüm bir şey var. Durmak, düşmek demektir bilimde. Dolayısıyla daima ileri gitmemiz gerekiyordu. Bu defa artık ince iğne başlamıştı. Onun için gittim fakat.
Unexplained lactic acidosis. And perhaps that was the best period of my career. Together with only few people, we try to solve that problem. Every month we have a new technique, and so we could proceed, and we became mitochondrial experts. And so in these patients, after 5 years, we found the cytochrome C oxidase deficiency. And it was the first patient in the world.
And we later on, genetics came in the field, and today nephrotic syndrome is a very diverse disorder, whereas when we started, we didn't know which was what. And Katja and I published the first paper, I think, on familial nephrotic syndrome in 76, but without genetics, only with looking to the papers and then putting hypotheses which were not so wrong.
There is a registry, or was a registry, already. I mean, one of the great things about the EDTA was it's recognized the need to record what we were doing in this very new field. And from 1970 onwards, there was a registry of the EDTA from before 19. And there was a pediatric supplement. And I know, for example, that there were 512, or was it 504, children on treatment for chronic renal failure in Europe in 1973.
And also my experience with HUS, as already mentioned, was both appalling and appealing. Professor Denis, the chief of the department, suggested me to concentrate on patients with kidney diseases. A mission impossible at first sight for me, until I read the first textbook on pediatric nephrology, the famous 1963 edition of Problèmes actuels de nephrologie infantile by Royer, Habib and Mathieu. A 500 pages thick Bible-like book with an amazing amount of many clinical and pathology features. It was obvious. Paris was the mecca of pediatric nephrology, and I had to go there.
It was, in many respects, a quite different world. The Vietnam War had been over, but in '69 there was the moon flight, so we thought, well, we were very, very optimistic that the world would change. But the reality was we had no personal computers, we had no photocopies, we had no fax. All had to be done by ordinary mail. And we had also to do statistics manually. So, one was not so productive as it is nowadays, of course. I was a fellow with René Habib in '66, and I was very fortunate. And she gave me a topic, and this was Alport syndrome, and we did the paper. It was a really very primitive compared with what is done now. Unfortunately, it was only in light microscopy and clinics and no electron microscopy, and I still feel if we had a chance to do electron microscopy, we would have been the first ones to see the typical lesions of Alports.
One challenge is that there is a lot of information of scientific material which is now available, even too much. When I was young, it was difficult to find out a paper, to find out a good congress.
But one of the things that always has struck me is how children with the most disastrous conditions bravely face a challenge and in spite of everything remain cheerful.
Dialysis machine. This is how we do modern day science and research. These are our laboratories, and this is one of the clever scientists. This is our modern day education centre where we learn to study.
The first meeting was interesting. The scientific papers were all short 10-minute papers and were of relatively unsophisticated level compared with today, although there were one or two people doing ultramicroscopy from Europe. I think it was good for us to meet up with all these people from Europe. I had no idea that there were so many people in various European countries who were doing nephrology.
It went on like that in the same way later on. One only could become a member if one had given a talk, and one could not just come to join and to listen. One had to be active.
What was discussed there was the papers that were presented were mainly on what one was doing at that moment in his department, her department. So I talked about the long-term evolution of nephrotic syndrome in children. Part of it was about treated children with ACTH and corticosteroids. Others had not been treated at all, and we compared both groups.
The activity of ESPN was based on building bridges between the different parts of Europe and building especially bridges across the Iron Curtain.
My career in nephrology started after a visit Glasgow because of Gavin Arnell.
Çünkü bana inanan ve benimle birlikte gece gündüz çalışan bir ekiple birlikteydim. O ekibi de Türkiye ile paylaşarak.
It was a nice meeting, not too big. We took a bit of a tour of the Scottish Highlands, that was very pleasant. Bit of whiskey and that sort of thing, it's nice.
You are very astute people, attending 2 anniversaries. 100 years ago, the first renal biopsies in either adults or children were performed here in Glasgow at the Royal Hospital for Sick Children. And 50 years ago, in 1967 with Harman Tiddens, when ESPN was pioneered. I never imagined what a success it would be. I would just like to say to all of you, on behalf of the children of Europe, whom you have benefited and who have benefited through ESPN, thank you for making my dream a reality and serving so many young people.
We are so blessed
by everything that you do. I mean, our daughter literally wouldn't be here without the progressive thinking, innovation, the determination, the passion to continually treat children with renal issues and to continually find new and better ways to treat them and to improve their lives, or to simply keep them alive. And I mean, like we've understood we've been involved in, I feel like, renal things now for 4 years because of Lucy, and we've seen even in that 4 years things moving on. And to think that, you know, the work that must have been done across those 50 years to get, you know, paediatric renal medicine to where it is now, and the fact as well, what I always find very inspiring, and what I find very inspiring through our experience of hospitals and medicine, is that there's never a point where anyone says, well, let's just stop here, this is great. Everyone's always looking to find new ways to treat and improve the treatment of children and improve their lives and what their enjoyment of life and what they can experience, you know. So all I would say is thank you so much for everything you do, and keep it up. And you got in this bed, or a bed like it, and then the nurse has got this machine, hooked it up to you, and then this machine took your blood out and cleaned it here, and then it put it back into you, all nice and clean.